to talk to you today about the North Atlantic right whales and bottlenose dolphins. I'm going to walk through some of the conservation challenges we face with some of the work we do. As Libby said, I work over in just across the harbor here at NOAA Fisheries. I'm a biologist with the Marine Mammal Branch, and my expertise is particularly with fisheries interactions in marine mammals. I'm just going to jump right in here. So just to kind of orient everyone to kind of what's going to be guiding this talk is we are charged with implementing the Marine Mammal Protection Act. As many of you probably know, all marine mammals in U.S. waters are protected, and they're also protected from take in high seas by U.S. citizens. So that's what's guiding us here today. I'm going to jump right in and talk a little bit about the North Atlantic right whale. The North Atlantic right whale, as Jeff alluded to earlier, is protected by the Endangered Species Act as well, but also they're listed as depleted under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. These animals are migratory, as many of you probably know. They mate and feed up in the Northeast, and then they travel down in the winter months to the only known calving grounds for these species right off the coast of Florida and Georgia. They typically are off the coast of Northeast Florida sometime between November and April. And what's interesting here is it's not just one big mass migration. We do tend to have the calving females come down a bit earlier and stay for longer periods of time, but there is a constant flux of animals going back and forth up and down the Atlantic coast throughout the November through April season. So what's challenging about right whales, particularly for conservation here in the Southeast, is there's a couple of things. First of all, obviously we're dealing with a lot of moms and calves down in our area, which as you can guess is a very vulnerable life stage. For moms, it's a very energetically costly stage. These animals tend to be very close to shore. When they migrate down, they tend to stay to the west of the Gulf Stream. So as you can see here, incredibly close to shore, putting them at risk for and close to more human impacts. These animals are difficult to see. Here they are right here. So as you can imagine, that causes some challenges too, particularly with ships. And unfortunately, right whales right now appear to be declining. This is a new paper that just came out, actually, I think last month by Richard Pace and his colleagues. And basically what they found here is, where's the pointer on this? Sorry. Is there a way to point?
Top button?
The top button?
There we go.
Oh, perfect, thank you. So if you kind of look at these black diamonds here, this is a new model looking at modeling the population of what's happening with right whales. And as you can see, this population was on an incline. It was increasing about 2.5% per year, which is still even slow for a large whale population. And then in 2015, we see this drastic decline in animals, which is, as you can imagine, very concerning for such a small population anyway. And what was even kind of more alarming in this paper was that they found there was diverging abundance trends between males and females, with adult females having reduced survival rates. So what are some of the threats we're dealing with right whales? So some of the things we manage are particularly ship strikes. That's one of there's two major threats to right whales: ship strikes and fixed gear fishing entanglements. And unfortunately, right whales, as we said, they travel close to shore. They're inside of the Gulf Stream to the west of it. So when they're migrating, they're migrating across a lot of very busy ports. And as I showed earlier, they're very difficult to see, which puts them at a very high risk to be hit by ships. Ships they don't have a way to see them, and there's no remote technology to know that the animal is there. So some of the strategies we employ at NOAA to try to mitigate this threat is we have an early warning system aerial surveys, which are flown off the coast of Georgia, and Florida to alert mariners to the presence of whales when they're in the area. We have a 500-yard approach rule to right whales. You cannot legally approach a right whale within 500 yards. We have a ship speed rule, which basically mandates that ships 65 feet or larger must go below 10 knots during the season in near ports. And we also have recommended shipping lanes based on some predictive models that show where whales likely are. So another major threat to right whales is entanglement in fixed gear fisheries, particularly trap pot gear. It seems to be a big problem. So many of you are probably familiar with trap pot gear, but it's a trap set at the bottom. There's this big vertical line attached to a buoy. What typically happens is the whale, we think when feeding, it has its mouth open, swims through the lines get tangled in the baleen, wraps the animal. Unfortunately, 83% of all right whales have entanglement scars, and 60% of those animals have been entangled more than once. This is a chronic problem, meaning that when the animals, if they are disentangled or they shed the gear on their own, there's still probably some long-term impacts there, and so it's really difficult to know how that's affecting the population over time. So we kind of take a two-pronged approach here to manage this problem. We have kind of as we call it, the Band-Aid solution, the short-term solution, which is the Atlantic Large Whale Disentanglement Network, which does some fantastic work. This network is basically from New Brunswick down here into the state of Florida. And essentially what they do, if there's a whale entangled and we can get people on the water in a safe environment, they'll go out and try to disentangle the animal. We also take kind of a longer term approach through the Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction Plan. This is a group of stakeholders, such as fishermen, managers, academics, all charged with helping NIMFs come up with regulations essentially to help reduce the threat of animals getting entangled in fishing gear. That rule was revised actually in 2014, and there was some more restrictions put on crab pot gear, particularly for blue crab off the coast of Florida. So as I said, quite a challenging species to manage, and unfortunately right now we are in the midst of an unusual mortality event for right whales. Since June of this year, we have seen a spike in deaths, which is in a very short time frame, which is what makes it an unusual mortality event. This graph is already outdated. We had another dead whale on Monday up in Cape Cod. We're now up to 16 dead right whales in this very short time frame, which is extremely concerning. And most of my colleagues are actually at the Marine Mammal Conference, and there was an international meeting on Sunday to try to talk about this and how we're going to address this problem. So now I'm going to totally switch gears and kind of jump into how we manage bottlenose dolphins, and you can see the differences and how the challenges we have to deal with are with these guys. So there are 25 stocks of bottlenose dolphins just in the state of Florida waters. This is our Gulf stocks here. These are our coastal stocks. These tend to be bigger, containing thousands of animals. We have two stocks here in Florida waters. We have this northern coastal stock here in yellow and the eastern coastal stock here in blue. And those animals are kind of moving along the coast throughout the year. But then we also have 16 estuarine stocks here in Florida, off the Gulf Coast, sorry, let me clarify, off the Gulf Coast here, and those are highlighted here by these blue and red stars. These tend to be resident animals into their particular bay or estuary, and their populations tend to be quite small, only usually a couple hundred animals. Along Florida's Atlantic coast, we have 4 estuarine stocks. As you can see highlighted here, we have in Jacksonville, Indian River, Biscayne Bay, and Florida Bay. We have 2 coastal stocks, the northern Florida coastal and the central Florida coastal, And we also might have a third migratory stock that comes in occasionally in the winter months, but we just don't have a lot of information on those animals, so we're not quite sure how far south they come and if they come into our waters and when they do that. So we have a lot of stocks to manage, essentially. And dolphins are typically very close to, bottlenose dolphins in particular, are very close to shore. They tend to be in bay sounds and estuaries, close to very densely populated areas. And so as you can imagine, that brings with it a lot of threats. So this is a paper that was published in 2014 that tried to categorize some of the threats, particularly in the Gulf for dolphins. And today I'm just going to kind of focus in on this aspect, and I'm going to talk about our challenges with illegal feeding and boater harassment. So just to jump back to the Marine Mammal Protection Act, as a reminder, it is illegal in U.S. waters to feed or even attempt to feed a marine mammal. But illegal feeding is a pretty it's a pretty intense problem here, particularly on the west coast of Florida, as you can see, and also in Panama City, Florida, in the Panhandle area. This graphic here is actually from our NOAA hotline that we have, where people can report feeding. And then actually one of the ways that we track feeding, given that we can't be everywhere at once, is through social media. We have interns that help monitor the site, and we're able to kind of get a sense of where it's happening and what the frequency is. So as you can see, the West Coast again and the Panhandle tends to be our real big hotspots there. So unfortunately, feeding activity tends to be probably profit driven, and it's particularly to pull people so people can have closer interactions with dolphins. And our poster child for this particular problem is Panama City, Florida. This is our biggest challenge in probably the Southeast United States, and particularly in Florida. Panama City tends to always be one step ahead of us, unfortunately, when it comes to feeding. So back in the 1990s, there was some blatant feeding going on. It's just people go out on their boats, feed the dolphins. And a lot of this was, again, in conjunction with the tour industry, which was trying to bring dolphins closer to boats. But as you can see, once we had some law enforcement go in and give some citations. They've evolved each time we've gone in with some law enforcement efforts. It's gone from underwater feeding to feeding dolphins from buckets to now feeding dolphins from bait boats. And I won't get into this. I don't think we have time today, but essentially the point here is that it creates a domino effect of challenges for us when dolphins are illegally fed. It creates a behavior change in the animal, and then the animal begins to seek out vessels, and so it puts them at risk of getting entangled in fishing gear, being retaliated against, health problems, and it also transmits through the population through social transmission, because these animals will teach one another how to beg for food. And so eventually it leads to population declines. And so now I was just going to briefly talk about harassment, again, illegal under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Even the potential to disturb a marine mammal is illegal. This is Key West, Florida. This is some work I did a few years back. The dolphin sightings here are plotted in blue, and the tour vessels, as you can see, are green, and they're all clustered together. Key West is a particularly hot spot for boater and dolphin harassment. The conditions are kind of perfect in Key West, right? You have clear, shallow water, great for viewing. But unfortunately, what happens is at one point in the early 2000s, we had up to 40 tour vessels viewing up to multiple times a day. So you can imagine the stress that puts on a small resident population of animals of only a couple hundred animals. Whoops. Same thing here in Panama City, Florida. Again, it's a problem when it comes, they have shallow, clear water close to the marinas. the tour operators have gone out and fed the dolphins, they've become highly conditioned, and they, unfortunately, now their behavior is kind of very unnatural at this point, and these animals are severely harassed, as you can see, because they do approach vessels. So there can be upwards of 20 vessels and 40 swimmers around a single animal at any given time. And again, this just gets to the point that there's, again, the domino effect of challenges for management. These short-term effects on behavior translate into long-term population decline. And so with dolphins, we take a little bit different strategy than we do with right whales. It tends to be more of an outreach and education-based strategy. And you can see we do anything from billboards to signage to using social media, and to doing educational programs such as our feature program, Dolphin Smart. And so just to wrap up here, I think with right whales and dolphins, our conservation challenges are constantly evolving. We've had to learn to be flexible and original in trying to address some of these challenges, particularly with dolphins. Having the better understanding all the great research that the Institute does and here at FWRI really helps us to better manage. The more information we have, the better we can manage. And our goal is just to continue to strive to ensure the recovery and survival of the species through our key tools, which is policy management and public outreach. So, thanks very much.
We'll do one question while we transition speakers.
Yes.
Why so many Canadian deaths?
It's not clear yet. We do know that the whales were in a spot where they typically aren't. Why, if that's a result of climate change or some other factors going on, we're not quite sure. And so, it could be that because they're in a spot where they not typically are, there's different types of gear, different types of challenges, but at this point, it's not completely clear what's going on.